Julian Jason Haladyn is an art historian, cultural theorist, and an assistant professor at OCAD University in Toronto. He is the author of several books, including The Pause, Experiencing Time Interrupted from 2024, Boredom and Art, Passions of the Will to Boredom from 2014, and the essay collection Duchamp Accelerated Contemporary Perspectives, also from last year. In addition, he is the co-editor with Michael E. Gardner of the Boredom Studies Reader from 2016, which I'm sure a lot of people here are aware of. So I'm going to pass over to Julian. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. My sharing is very weird. When I share, I can't see anything. I need a verbal confirmation. Can people see my presentation?
Yes, it's working.
Okay. So I can't see responses or reactions, unfortunately. But yeah, my talk today is on Bored with History, and I think it follows perfectly on Julia's presentation. Thank you for that. Looking specifically at art and postmodernism, although I'm going to be going back to the 19th century to kind of frame this. I wanted to begin with a quote by Frederick Jameson. Postmodernism is a concept that attempts to think the present historically in an age that has forgotten how to think historically in the first place. It's a quote that I like quite a bit. I return to it frequently in a lot of my current research. And there are two parts to it that I really wanted to focus on today. The first is this idea of to think the present historically and what exactly that means. And to do that, as I said, I wanted to go back to the great nemesis of Schopenhauer, Hegel. For Hegel, history was something very particular. And when he gives his lectures on history, he tries to share a sense of what he's trying to capture. And by this, must be understood not a collection of general observations, respecting it, suggested by the study of its records, proposed to be illustrated by its facts, but universal history itself. I think maybe just a little note that for Hegel, I think universal is not exactly what we think it means today. It's not as absolutizing, but it's a pretty large idea, generally speaking. And he wants us to really focus on what this version of history would be. And in one of my personal favorite quotes from his text, he notes that history comprehends not less what happened than the narration of what happened. Or to give a basic translation, it doesn't matter what happened, it's the story. And Hegel really believed this in some very clear and obvious ways throughout his research. It's this version of history that we really adapt today. And so this is why I wanted to start with that, because when we're talking about an understanding of history or a lack of understanding in the contemporary day, this is what I think we have to have in the back of our minds. The second, since I'm dealing with art, is just a very brief look at history painting, which is parallel but has a distinct history to it. History painting as a practice within the Western tradition is one that up until the 19th century and even into the 19th century a little bit was the highest form of art that could be accomplished. Large scale, multi-figure, complex. It demands universal knowledge. Though the most important element of the painting is the human element, as Blunt will say. Walter Benjamin, in his theses on a philosophy of history, goes through his own definition of what history is, a lot more poetic, as Benjamin is wanted to do. But he, at one point, turns to art as a way of kind of materializing or conceptualizing what it is. And he specifically turns to a painting by Paul Klee, in which the artist represents what for Benjamin is the angel of history. who, as Benjamin says, is turned towards the past, where we see the appearance of a chain of events. He sees one single catastrophe, which increasingly piles rubble on top of rubble and hurls it before his feet. Benjamin will go on to talk about this storm that starts blowing and literally blowing the angel whose wings can't be closed. The storm drives him irreversibly into the future, as he says. And he ends by noting that that which we call progress is the storm. Progress is fundamental to a modern conception of history. It is how history functions. This is a key thing for Hegel and for any kind of discusser of history. And as many boredom studies people have noted, including Elizabeth Goodstein, boredom depends on the modern conception of history as progress. There's a very important link between these, specifically because of the way that this idea of progress leads to a very particular kind of psychological and mental situation for the individual, who then has to contend with this relationship and always feeling outside of it. One can never truly be part of history. History is always something that you can be proximate to, but this is a problem that has been discussed, looked at, and is considered throughout a lot of the modern period. This changes a little bit, in my opinion, and in the opinion of a number of people, when we get to contemporary work, or the postmodern, or after the postmodern, depending on your perspective. And this is a time when, to go back to Jameson, we forget how to think historically in the first place. We don't actually completely understand what it means to think historically. Why? Because of the fact that we start to mix up this sensibility that the historical can also be part of a present. For Jameson, he points towards a kind of privatization of experience, in which the subject of history is located outside of these narratives, but also at the same time needs to be inside in order to have meaning, to experience meaning. And so this relationship between the inside and the outside in this case becomes quite important. Obviously a key issue for all looks at boredom. I'm going to be looking at three artists, as it talks about in the abstract. The three of them kind of approach this problem in different ways. The Hong Kong-born, New York-based artist, David Dow, is one person who talks about this privatization of experience in his work through a very specific and direct means. He catalogs his own experience. In his Barnett Newman series, which is what I'm talking about, he presents Barnett Newman's career through David Dow, his own experience of it. Here we have the paintings to scale from 1991, in which each of the years is noted in the paintings that he did. It's a very dull way of presenting the work of an artist who, has very dynamic, very emotional work. But these canvases are reduced to little blue blots. He actually does different colors of this particular painting, but in this case, I chose the blue. David Dow's painting emerges as an exploration of modern history, linked to his personal trajectory and artistic career. This is a review that comes from a catalog of David Dow. And so here you can see, and a number of critics will actually point this out, that he really is a very personal painter. It might look very minimal, reduced to nothing, and very impersonal, but quite the opposite. It's actually him thinking through the career of another artist who he respected greatly. One of the great critics and philosophers of art that really talks around this idea, and I don't actually give him a lot of credit in this particular presentation, but I didn't want to leave him out completely, is Arthur C. Danto. He writes a book called After the End of Art, and raised a lot of controversy around this because claiming that art is ended, a very Hegelian notion, is a little bit of an overstatement, you could say. But for Danto, what he's talking about is, after the ascent to philosophical self-reflection, this idea that as soon as art turns into something that is self-reflection, dealing more with the self than anything else, we're not really talking about art in the same sense as we used to in modernism. That is art that participates and is interested in engaging with a history, various histories. Now history is subsumed under the question of the self in one way or another. One of the other artists I'm looking at, probably the least known of the three, is Toronto Canadian-based artist Sheila Ahurst. I picked a very particular work of hers. This is Pulling Serenity Through Time and Space from 1976, in which she does a series of prints of Leonardo da Vinci painting, but they're misregistered. They're kind of stuttering through space. And there is a sense in which you could read these as accidents, as a failure to pay attention to technique. But you can also see it in a sense as the artist's boredom with history, with these images. They're not paintings anymore as much as images that we're bombarded with. And that for her, it becomes more interesting, more playful, you could say, with this kind of stuttering effect. The third, probably by far, in my opinion, the most quote unquote boring of the three artists, is On Kawara. On Kawara is somebody whose work I've loved for many, many years. He became famous primarily because of this work, what are called his date paintings, in which he paints on a simple background the date of the day that he painted it. And I love teaching his work because it really fights the idea of progress when you're teaching art students. If you look at his work from 1981 versus his work from the 90s or the 2000s, there's nothing that you could call progress. I can't say, wow, that date is much better than the one that he did the previous year. It doesn't make sense. The work is so basic in certain ways. But the self-reflective quality is quite interesting and kind of asks some interesting questions. In many ways, as I'm arguing in my current research, contemporary art is bored with history. It's this boredom that becomes a key feature of art's current sense of its own historicization, how it understands, how it sees history, how it reproduces it, how it situates a practice within it. This bored with history, I mean in a very broad sense. On Kawara's work is bored with history in very particular ways. On one hand, it's embracing history at the most basic level. Dates tell us when something, quote unquote, important happens. And so he gives us the date. But that's all he gives us. Below this, you can see the full work is actually also the production of a box, and he cuts out the front page of a newspaper wherever he happens to be in the world and puts it in the box. Most museums do not exhibit that part of it. They only exhibit the paintings, but this is his full conception of the work. But the kind of arbitrariness of it, and having gone to, I thought there was another slide next, having gone to exhibitions of On Kawara's work, it's always fascinating to me when I run across a piece that is so meaningful to me because of the date, realizing that it's meaningful to me. Again, it's a privatization. It's about my experience of that date. There are, of course, shared dates, but even at a shared date, will have different resonance for different viewers. The bored with history, again, I want this to be something that is considered very much on a case-by-case basis. It's shared in the generic and general sense, but with each of the people I'm looking at, it is different. For Ahurst, this is much more about a literal boredom with the way that art history itself is just subsumed within image culture especially in the contemporary day and age where we're overwhelmed with images. And so a Leonardo da Vinci painting, one of the great masters of the Renaissance, is just another image amongst thousands, millions of images that we encounter. It seems to be no better, no less. And in fact, we don't even bother to go see most artwork anymore. I have a colleague who complains about this all the time, that so many art history professors teach work not as work, but as images that they've collected off the internet that we look at in books and the like. And so this boredom is one of experience. Art has developed a very problematic relationship with this idea of thinking historically, at once failing to appreciate the role of history in current practice. The history of, for example, Leonardo da Vinci. Why do we study him? There are actually answers to this question. We don't always share them with students. We don't always talk about them, but there are very clear reasons why he has the status that he does within the canon of Western art history. And for Sheila Ahern, there's a reluctance to treat this historically because that's not the way that she encountered it. She presents it as an image and forces us to see it as an image by, again, repeating it. In this case, this is one of the two dark ones. There's also lighter ones, as you might have seen at the very beginning when I showed the larger piece.
I think we might have lost Julian. Julian, can you still hear us?
Sorry, did something happen? Am I missing? What was that noise?
I think we lost you there for a minute.
Oh, where did you lose me?
You were just saying that there's a lighter image of it as well, and then you changed to the one where there's the original next to it. And that's where we lost you.
Okay, thank you. I will go back. Yeah, I was just talking about the fact that this relationship to the original is a problematic one because the original kind of loses meaning. We don't see the meaning in it as much anymore as we do in the reproductions, the images that are readily available to us in various ways. The appreciation of the role of history is also an attempt to turn history into the present, turn the present into history. And this is where Kawara is a great example. For him, he's trying to capture that exact moment. This is a painting of May 15th, 1981, painted on May 15th, 1991, with a cover from the newspaper, May 15th, 1991. So we see the present and it feels historical, but it really isn't in certain ways. This was the image I thought was previous, where you can see the variety of the work that he presents, different sizes. And of course, February 27th seems like it's much more important than some of the smaller dates. Why? Because it's bigger. But there's an arbitrariness to this, and Kawara plays with that. For David Dow, this idea of attempting to turn the present into history is, again, something that's very personal. He wants to turn the history of Barnett Newman into something that's important for him in the present. His present becomes part of the history of Barnett Newman, or at least the attempt to create a history with Newman's work. His work responds directly to Newman and looks at the scale, looks at color patterns, looks at a lot of the qualities of what Newman was trying to do, but there's a huge difference between, again, this idea of a man heroic and sublime by Newman, one of his more famous works, and David Dow's Barnett Newman, The Paintings in Scale. It catalogs. It is more information than it is anything else. It's a lack of knowledge, you could say, in certain ways. He presents histories of the history of Newman's work. This is Newman's, his triangular paintings. And my personal favorite work from the series, his Gap Years. Beautiful painting. All it does is just show two dates when between which Newman didn't produce anything, the kind of nothingness of this particular moment in Newman's life. Following the changes in postmodern art, we see a necessary change in the vocabulary of history painting. In a different presentation at a conference a number of years ago, I actually discussed An Kawara and David Dow as contemporary history painters, precisely because of the fact that they work with the basic components of history painting, large scale, complex information at the very least, even if it's not visual composition in every case. But they increasingly confront not history proper, but rather the arbitrariness of historiography, the way that the individual who is cataloging a piece of history has so much power as to decide what is vital and what is not. In David Dow's case, he chronicles all the works by date, which on one hand is completely inclusive. On the other hand, it's actually quite dull. It's not a very exciting piece of information, because then it just becomes these lists of dates. For An Kawara, this is the way in which we chronicle things and the abstractness of various practices. The newspaper, what happens to make it or not make it based on the given newspaper, which for him is also based on the arbitrariness of where he is in the world, as well as the arbitrariness of this way of documenting our days, the calendar, and the month, day, and year, which, as we're all aware, is actually quite an imperfect system. Better systems have been created, but we stick to ours for various reasons. History is the succession of the rupture of history, wherein this identification plunges back in itself and decision recurs. This is Jean-Luc Nancy talking about Hegel. This idea of history in a more contemporary sense being defined as the breaking of its own history is something that I think, again, loops us back into the questions of boredom, because boredom seems to exist at that moment of the rupture, where we're not exactly sure what the value, the meaning of what we're looking at is. Is it actually helpful to look at all the paintings to scale based on year? Does this give us more value to our experience of Newman and his practice, or of David Dow and his practice? Some of us will say yes, some of us will say no. This rupturing of history is something that, again, ties into the way that when we're thinking of experience, and especially the way that history relates to the present in our contemporary day and age, we're not exactly sure what historical is. Is the Renaissance still something that has great historical value? I think a general answer would obviously be yes, but I think it's important to ask the question. Maybe that is a contemporary thing to do. For Sheila Ahern, as an artist, she didn't want to just make the assumption that Leonardo da Vinci, was vital. She allowed the work to ask the question of what his value is, through her own practice, through her own translation or iteration of the image that she encountered. Postmodernism in this way depends on an increased sense of self-awareness and the creative act, and a self-conscious understanding of history, and that relationship is really what my current research is about. Self-awareness as a creator, as somebody who approaches work, both in terms of literally physically creating it, but also I'm thinking of historians who are trying to think through, write about, and understand why certain practices are important and respected and followed in the current day and age. Self-awareness is tied again to modern boredom in a very particular way. Specifically, the ways in which it talks about the individual. It talks about the quest for the individual, starting with the Romantics, starting with the Declaration of Universal Human Rights, starting with the responsibility that gets imposed upon individuals in the 19th century. This is the modern period par excellence. And so I wanted to end with a little bit of a, if you could call it a quote, from a current text I just finished writing around this whole idea of boredom and self-awareness, to understand the history of modern boredom and its development up to the current day and age, including its historiography and pathologization, I believe it's necessary to recognize that behind the act of being bored is an imperative towards self-awareness. I choose my word very particularly or very carefully, imperative. It is this imposition. And for me, that relationship is core. To understand why boredom is so important to us, why we devote this entire conference, why people continue to write books, is because there is an imperative to try to be aware and be valuable within modern societies, within contemporary societies. And boredom, for me, I think is linked to that in some very key ways. I'm going to do the wonderful thing of now going back and trying to figure out how to get out of this. I'm not sharing. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was great. Really interesting. Do we have anyone raising their hand for a question? I think I was quite interested in and this is some sort of like half remembered thing that I am now vaguely remembering about sort of the difference between information and, you know, like actual meaning, and I guess the important role that you know, information and displaying information kind of like you know, yeah, accumulating information as well plays in a lot of like modern and postmodern and contemporary art, and whether that kind of feeds into yeah, boredom or its connection with boredom. I think that was one thing that I was thinking about while you were giving your talk. And the other thing that I was vaguely reminded of was that really short article by Alva Noé, who wrote about, you know, is it fine for art to be boring, and kind of has that idea that it's totally fine for art to be boring because we create meaning from the art. So if I look at that painting and you know, it's just information, I am the one who kind of has to make that leap of like turning it into something that I sort of understand. Or like you were talking about the Onkavara picture, like when I look at one and I kind of realize, oh, this is an important date for me, maybe specifically, that turns it into sort of meaning, whereas for someone else it'd just be a boring painting. Yeah, those are the two things that I sort of like was reminded of, and I was wondering whether that's kind of resonates with some of your thoughts.
Yes, absolutely. I think there is a different version of this paper that could have been about that relationship to information and the kind of emphasis we have on information. I mean, thinking back to the first presentation, the idea of going to the outback, going into the wilderness, and there is a sense in which confronting the spectacle, the sublime moment of the landscape, will never live up to the kind of information that gets gathered to such an extent. You know, you look forward to these things when you travel, you research, you see it, and then when you're standing there, sometimes that information is just not reflected. It becomes something different. And so, yeah, I think for contemporary culture, there is really a large question around how we relate to and understand information and meaning, and how meaningful information can be in a very clear way. Sorry, what was your second point? I usually have a pretty good memory, but I'm blanking on your second point now. So
That's fine. That was to do with sort of the almost like personal meaning that art can create. That kind of notion that, you know, like all of a sudden that like one painting of a certain date kind of becomes important.
Yeah, no, I think that's also really important and great to bring up because of the fact that your question, you know, can an artwork be boring? But there is also maybe the more important question for the contemporary day and age is, can viewers be bored with art? Is it okay for me to go to the Louvre, stand in front of the Mona Lisa and think, I'm not interested. This is boring to me. I've seen it millions of times. It's just so overwhelming. And again, this is an experience that it's wonderful when you teach and you have to teach said material, because you show this over and over and over again. The students see it so often. And so that excited, engaged response is not always present when you think it should be. And so this is something that I feel like I'm trying to tie together our entire panel. Goes back to Romanticism, because the Romantics become very involved and very interested in viewership and viewers and how the viewer relates to work. And so that moment of a viewer being interested and needing to be interested then inspires modern art in so many ways. So yeah, thank you for your comments and questions.
Thank you. That was a really good answer. Like you said, yeah, it summed up a lot of things in one go. Any other comments, questions, thoughts?
I have a question, or rather a clarification that I want from the end of the presentation when you talk about self-awareness. Is it a self-awareness on the artist's part or the viewing experience?
That's a very good question. And it's one that I have to admit, just to begin with, I never thought of when I put it together. So I'm going to go on the fly here. But I think there's a case to be made for both. And maybe just since we're talking about boredom, the lack of overlap between the two in certain ways, because the artist's self-awareness of what's going on, how they relate to things, David Dow's relationship to art history, to how history exists for him, and his representation of that history in his literal work is one version of that. But me standing in front of Anquara's painting, I remember I went to see one of the works and I was captivated by it. I thought it was so beautiful. I thought it was so amazing, the formal elements of it. And the person I was with was bored to tears with the show, because why do you want to look at a bunch of squares with information? You can get technically the same information from an art history book. So why turn it into a painting? I think that level of self-awareness, if I was forced to pick between the two, I would definitely pick the side of the viewer again, because the viewer's self-awareness as to why something is being presented, what its value is, seems to be more in jeopardy in contemporary practice than the other version. So that would be the on-the-fly answer at the very least.
Thank you.